Hello and welcome. Yes, I was talking away and my mic was muted, so rookie mistake. All right, so welcome. Thank you for joining us today for the Connecticut SAT School Day Training. My name is Michelle Rosado and I work at the State Department of Education, and I'm joined by my colleagues who will introduce themselves. I'm going to start with Deirdre Ducharme.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deirdre. I work with Michelle at the Connecticut State Department of Education, and my role is to help support you and your students who will be using accommodations and supports on the upcoming Connecticut SAT.
And hi, everybody. I'm Adrienne Cupper. I work for the College Board, and I manage the implementation for the state of Connecticut for the Connecticut SAT School Day. And so I help to answer a lot of your questions and address a lot of the things that you have going on. So I'll be covering some test day specific content coming up soon.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Keisha Smith. I'm from the College Board. I support the CSDE team along with our College Board team to ensure that the accommodations are put in place for students testing for Connecticut SAT School Day.
Great, thanks. I want to just remind everyone that's on the call that you're in listen-only mode. However, we want to take your questions. You can type them into the question box. And we'll answer them as we go along. And we will also, if we have time at the end, we'll take questions via a hand raise or through the question box. At the conclusion of the session, we will add the questions that were asked during this session to the Google Doc that I've shared with all test coordinators, in addition to the questions that were submitted in the last week's training. And this session is being recorded and it will be posted to the Connecticut State Department of Education website. So before we get started, I just want to say a big thank you to all of you, educators and administrators. Thank you for the work that you're doing on behalf of your students and your families. A special big thank you to our school counselors. Very, very necessary part working with families and students, especially given the stresses and the compounding issues that we're dealing with now. So thank you, thank you. All right, so our agenda today, I'm going to do a brief overview, and then Deirdre and Keisha are going to talk about accommodations very briefly, because we have done several trainings about accommodations. Those are posted on our website if you've missed anything. And then the bulk of the presentation is going to be done by Adrienne, and she's going to take you through everything you need to know about administering the Connecticut SAT School Day. And then on this slide is our pets, our different pets, my Stella and Adrienne's Freddie, and Abe, it's two cats, Pearl and Couch. All right, here's our contact information if you didn't know about it. The best way to reach Deirdre or myself is via email. However, you certainly can reach out on the phone. On test day, I will be in the office, and I am in the office occasionally, but you certainly, if you reach out by email, that's probably the best way for both of us. We have a few ways that we communicate with you. The main way we communicate is that I often send emails directly to test coordinators, just letting you know what's going on and the big news items that you need to know. We also produce a student assessment newsletter that comes out every few weeks. And you should be getting an email with a link to that newsletter when it comes out, because all coordinators are on that list. If you're not, you can sign up directly. And then also we have a website, the link is there. And the College Board has a website that has a lot of different information. Okay, so let's talk about participation, because I know that everyone is really a little bit anxious, and we had some questions submitted in advance about, you know, what's going on. I've got kids in different situations. Not everybody's in my building. We're not in the building all the time. So the Connecticut State Department of Education, our expectation on participation is that all students will participate in summative assessments, including the SAT. The only option for SAT is in-person, paper and pencil tests. We don't have remote testing available for this test or for our alternate assessment. However, the State Department has applied for a federal waiver for accountability. And if we are granted that waiver, that means that schools won't be held accountable to reach that 95% participation rate. There won't be any classifications of schools, etc. We don't know when we're going to get notice that we've been approved for that, or what the we don't know really when we'll be hearing something, but of course we'll be communicating with schools as soon as we know. And so I mentioned a lot of people have sent me emails about this, like we have a lot of our students learning remotely all the time. We've got different cohorts, our buildings are closed on Wednesdays. So we have added quite a bit of flexibility in terms of testing, flexibilities to the start times, allowing you to test in multiple locations, such as a central office or another school building or a town building. Additionally, you can test outdoors. And Adrian's going to talk a little bit in more detail about these flexibilities. Just a big overarching calendar of what's going on and the dates to be looking forward to. The deadline to apply for accommodations has passed. However, we want you to continue to submit your accommodation request if you have new students that have moved in, or if for some reason something was overlooked. And Deirdre will mention about this. The deadline to submit requests for English learners, time and a half, is the 12th, which is Friday. You should have already received your coordinator's planning kit. Those were coming this week. And then there's some other deadlines here, other dates of note. I feel like I skipped one. Yeah. Well, we added an extra makeup day this year just to allow you more flexibility in terms of testing your students. It'll allow you to break the administrations up if you need to, if you can't mix cohorts and things like that. And if your school happens to be closed on the primary date, most of you are testing March 24th, and about 20% are probably testing on April 13th. You would use those makeup days if you're not open on your primary test date. The manuals are posted on our website. There's 3 of them. They're also in your coordinator's kit. Training, that's what you're going through right now. You also need to train your staff. I know many of you did training in the fall for your staff for SAT. And in that case, we ask that you just complete another brief training. You do have to retrain everyone, and you also have to have them test the staff sign the staff agreement. So you still need to complete a testing administration for your proctors and your staff that are administering. And then there's a brief survey that I'm asking you to complete after you've done your training for your staff. Just a reminder, the scores are reported through EdSite Secure, as well as the portal, the College Board Score Report portal. And students access their results through their College Board account. Okay, some of you might have gotten an email today about doing bulk registration, and I just want to make sure that you understand that you do not need to do bulk registration for the Connecticut SAT school day. We actually submit a file, the State Department does, on your behalf through using the PSIS registration system of all your grade 11 students. We submitted 2 files already, one on January 21st for the school's testing on March 24th, and one on February 3rd for those of you testing on April 13th. That's the first file. That's the file that's going to be used to create pre-ID labels. But then we submit 2 additional files to account for students moving in and out of your school from the time of now until testing is just about complete. So till April 20th would be the last file we submit. So just make sure that you're working with your PSIS coordinator to make sure they're maintaining an updated list of grade 11 students. And just as a reminder, unlike the Smarter Balance, we do not use TIDE for the Connecticut SAT school. So your labels and your answer sheets, just real brief. I mentioned the dates of when we created the labels, and I think you're all aware of these pieces of information on here, and I know Adrian's going to cover it, so I'm just move ahead. And we created this flyer, I think, a couple of years ago, but it is available for you to use during the answer sheet completion for the 4 free college sends. These are the codes for all the colleges and universities in Connecticut. The flyer is actually 2-sided. So on one side, it has all the public colleges and universities, and on the other side are the privates. So you can print it double-sided. Many students in Connecticut apply to colleges in Connecticut. So I think it's a nice way to have them, easy, convenient way to get them. But additionally, all the score send codes are available in the student answer sheet instruction booklet for every single college that a student might want to put down. And here are some reminders that you want to just make sure that your students and parents are aware of. No penalty for guessing. There's practice through Khan Academy. Make sure your students have a College Board account, and they can cancel their scores if they want or choose which scores to send. And all scores that they earn on the Connecticut SAT school day are college reportable. And the College Board Opportunity Scholarship is something that you might want to make sure your students are aware of in case they're interested in applying for that. Okay, right now I'm going to turn it over to Deirdre Ducharme.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to spend this Wednesday afternoon with you as you prepare for the upcoming administration of the Connecticut SAT. Again, my role is to partner with you and the College Board to support any accommodations and supports that your students with disabilities and English learners may need on the upcoming assessment. Now, most of the work that you've conducted up into this point is it's pretty much complete. You've worked with your students to make sure that their accommodations are reviewed and submitted through SSD. So if you do need a refresher on any of the materials that we've made available to you this past year, such as PowerPoints, learning modules on the enhanced SSD system, etc., please review our Connecticut SAT School Day webpage, as we have a variety of materials available to you. In the next few slides, I will provide a review in the context of pre-administration planning. And later in this training, Adrian will walk through a more detailed overview of how you'll use the non-standard administration report, otherwise known as the NAR, which is generated in SSD about 4 weeks prior to testing. So the NAR is actually going to give you a lot of information as you determine the test environment that your students will need, the types of materials, accommodations, scripts, etc. for pre-planning activities. So stay tuned for more information on that later in this presentation. And if at the end of this presentation you have any unanswered questions about accommodations, please reach out to me. You can write your questions in the chat box. My colleague Keisha is going to help piggyback on disseminating some of this information as well. So please let us know if you have any specific questions along the way. So as you think about the type of accommodations that are approved for your students, keep in mind the provisions that may be necessary for pre-planning activities. So for instance, think about some of the specialized learning testing environments that your students may be approved for and what will need to be in place in order to make sure that those testing environments are ready on primary test day. Additionally, you want to make sure that the proper computer usage that's needed for some of your students who may be using assistive technology formats or the MP3 audio or maybe Braille test materials, that the technology is tested and it's working in advance to test day. You also want to provide your students with an appropriate opportunity to practice some of these technologies if applicable for their accommodation needs. So again, if students are using technology, you'll want to work with your technology coordinator and make sure that things are in place before test day. Next slide, please. So while there are no substantial changes to how you request accommodations for this upcoming assessment, I want to bring to your attention that the College Board has renamed some of the accommodations and supports that you're familiar with. So for instance, when we look at extended time, we're now referencing 50% to time and 1/2 and double time for those students receiving 100% extended time. So just make a note to some of the naming conventions that are listed on this slide. And I also want to point out to you to reference materials that we have available. Again, just as a refresher, if you're a new coordinator or a new SSD coordinator, check out the how-to guide for spring 2021 SAT school day, and then also the College Board Supports and Accommodations Handbook. So those links are included in this presentation and also available on our website. Next slide, please. Now, Keisha's probably going to add some more information about some considerations for students who are approved for the pre-recorded audio MP3. But I just want to remind you that this particular accommodation is provided through through a streaming application. It's something that for your students who are approved, you're going to want to download this application prior to test day. There are several steps that you'll complete prior to testing. So for instance, prior to test day, you're going to download this application. You're going to make sure it's installed on any of the devices that students will be using to access their assessment. And you're also going to follow specific directions on streaming instructions that are available not only on SSD online, but also in your accommodated testing manual. Keisha, is there anything you'd like to add?
I just wanted to put a quick reminder here, and we did have that in the previous slide also, was that just remember that with pre-recorded audio, which is MP3, that will automatically include 100%. There is not an option available at this time to reduce the amount of time for the test. The second section for written and language, that actually takes much longer, and so the total amount of time required would be the 100% in order for the student to receive the accommodation. There is no self-pacing. The total amount of time would need to be allotted, and the 100% time is also equivalent for the student or students to test over 2 days.
Great, thanks, Keisha. All right, next slide, please. So at this point, you may still have you may have some supports to enter for your English learners that are eligible for 50% time and a half. So just pay attention to the deadline. We do have a deadline for this upcoming Friday. So make sure the entries are submitted through SSD online. And just keep in mind that there isn't parental consent that's required for the purpose of submitting this support for the Connecticut SAT school day. We've received some questions about this, and as long as your student has an English learner plan or other documentation maintained locally that substantiates that your student's receiving English learner supports and services, then that suffice for submitting this request. Again, this is only allowable for the purposes of the Connecticut SAT school day, and if your students are not approved for this support, then they should not be using the extended time. Also note on this slide that we have other supports available for your English learners. So if you have students who would benefit from written test directions in their native language, you can access these directions on our portal and download them and make sure that they're available at the time of testing. We also provided the College Board's approved list of bilingual dictionaries, also posted to our portal. And then if you have a student who might benefit from having the directions provided to them in their native language, if you have a staff member who's trained and speaks that language, then that is an allowable support. And these 3 specific supports indicated on your slide do not have to be requested for approval through the SSD. Next slide, please. Okay, so as a reminder, test coordinators do not need to order materials for students approved for accommodations. Your test materials are going to be shipped for students based on the accommodation materials that they've been approved for in SSD online. If, though, you have a student who's new to your school, or if there's a last-minute change between now and the primary test day in which your students' needs have changed and may need some a different format, then please not only submit that request through SSD, but reach out to me so that I can work with Keisha to make sure that the test materials are available to your student on the primary test day, or if your student qualifies for testing during that 2-week accommodated window, that the materials are available within that time frame. Next slide, please. As mentioned earlier, it is encouraged that students receiving specific accommodations have an opportunity to use the College Board practice site. So if you have students who are using assistive technology or the pre-recorded audio MP3, pay attention to these practice tests that we have available for students. And if you'd like to request a practice test for students using Braille or large print materials, please reach out to the SSD customer service contact information included on this slide. Next slide, please. We've included some common questions that usually occur last minute prior to testing. We understand that certain situations arise that you can't necessarily control for. So, for example, if you have a student who at last minute decides that he or she does not want to use a particular accommodation, we do request that the waiver for using the accommodation be put in writing, and that's something that consent is something that you would maintain locally with your school. And before you choose to approve the student's right to not use the accommodation, just keep in mind what that specific accommodation is and how it might impact things that you've already put in place for the purposes of test administration. So perhaps by having the student not use the accommodation, it might compromise the test materials that you currently have available, or the test settings, the staffing needs, etc. So just make note of that. Additionally, if you have a student who has an unexpected health situation, such as a broken arm or a concussion, then we do have a special process in place in which you'll contact the SSD office to request the temporary physical medical disability form. We also request that you conduct an emergency 504 planning meeting to determine the supports and accommodations that the student's going to need for instruction and assessment as well. And so based on what those findings are, you would request the supports directly through SSD. You're not going to be submitting these requests through the SSD online. Again, if we're talking about a student who qualifies for a temporary disability, the College Board does have a special process in place specific for that purpose. And then finally, if you're entering any last minute accommodations and you're asked to submit documentation, we do have the form that you can access on our webpage to bypass this upload process. Essentially, it's a one-pager. It just verifies that based on the student's 504 plan or IEP that the student requires the given accommodation, you can use this form to bypass the requirement of submitting additional documentation. And again, if you have any questions about this, please reach out to me. Next slide, please. Finally, if you have a student who has a medical condition such that he or she is not able to attend school or receive instructional or homebound services, then there is a special process we have in place called a medical exemption. So if you have a student who is unavailable to test on the primary test day or the 3 makeup dates that you see on your slide, and again, if the caveat is if the student's not receiving instructional supports or services, then please reach out to me after May 18th. We have a medical form that can be completed by your student's treating physician, and some additional paperwork. This is something that you would submit to our office by May 25th, and we can move forward with approving a medical exemption. If you have questions about this process, please refer to Appendix B of the assessment guidelines, or you're welcome to reach out to me with any questions. Keisha, is there anything you'd like to add?
Thank you, Deirdre. And I thought it was just important with the reminder to everyone about submitting only the CT SAT school day form itself. In most cases, that is the only piece of document that you would need to submit in order for students to be approved. If there are any requests that would come up, such as if something's identified as other, student testing over multiple days, as an example, in those cases, I will reach out directly to Deirdre, and she will follow up with the school for more information. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so we're going to start test day items now. If you can just, Michelle, can you just, are you able to see my screen you're seeing before the test?
Yes.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So that's great. So we're gonna move forward and talk about test day items now. So this is broken up into kind of 3 chunks of content. The first thing we're going to cover is before the test. Then what we'll cover is things that you have to worry about on test day, and then things that you need to think about for after the test. So we'll just get right on into here and talk about our planning for before the test. Alrighty, so let's just cover a few terms that you'll need to know. Obviously, CSDE is the Connecticut State Department of Education. SSD is the Services for Students with Disabilities. AI code is the 6-digit code that is unique to your school, and that helps identify your school to the College Board. The non-standard administration report is talked about with the acronym of NAR, so we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. There are some forms that you need to be aware of. The TRMR is the Testing Room Materials Report. This is a form that's used to account for the materials in a specific testing room, and that's used by the proctor in that room. And then there's the CRF, or the Coordinator Report Form. That's used by the coordinator to account for all of the used and unused materials in the entire school before you send things back to us. And then there's the IR, or the Irregularity Report, and that's the form that you use if there is an irregularity in testing, some sort of disruption or issue. You report that to us using an Irregularity Report. So we're going to start off talking about things you need to do to prepare your school for testing. So like I said, the AI code, each school that is testing as part of the CSDE school day has a 6-digit AI code, or attending institution code. And this identifies your school to the College Board. If you need to contact us, it's always good to have that code available. It makes it easier for us to identify your school and help you with any issue you may have. And so the AI codes are required to do a lot of things related to College Board, especially to be able to see students, to receive materials and then see students' scores. In Connecticut, the AI codes are 6 digits, as I mentioned, but they typically start with the numbers 07. And the AI code is the only code that you will need for forms and any sort of reporting that you've got. Now, let's talk about preparing yourself for testing. There are a couple things to do to make sure that you're ready to give the test to students, to your students. First thing is, and you're doing it right now, you need to participate in this particular mandatory coordinators training. We also need you to read the coordinator's manual. You will be getting a copy of that in the mail shortly, and it's also available online. You will need to distribute the testing room manuals to the proctors or SSD coordinators for their review. So whoever is going to be proctoring testing for your students, you need to make sure that they've also got their versions of the manuals to read. We'll need you to review the contents of the coordinator planning kit. They're set to arrive between February 9th and February 11th, so you should get them. You may have gotten one already, but it will come to your attention. That has copies of each of the manuals in it, so that you can review them. but it also has copies of each of the forms in it. So there's different forms I mentioned earlier, and it's just so that you can see them and so that you can make yourself familiar with them prior to test day. There are also some posters in there that you can use to put up in your school to make sure students are aware of the test and when they'll be taking the test. And in general, you want to make sure that you're planning ahead. So we typically send out the coordinator planning kit about 6 weeks before test day. Those of you who may be testing on April 13th, you get it about 8 weeks before test day. But it's very important that you start planning now. There are some things that you want to think about and think through with enough time to make changes to schedules and all that kind of stuff. So definitely start now. Make sure you review your materials when you get them, and everything will go a lot more smoothly if you are planning ahead. So next, what I'm going to talk about is building your list. So lists of students that you will need to be able to give the test. So the first thing we're going to talk about is master student list. Your master student list is the list of students that you will be testing at your school. So the entire list of students, all the students that will be testing. You want to create this list because what that will do is it gives you a solid list to work from to know who you need to plan rooms for and who you need to plan to have staffs available for. And it also is a list that you can then use when you're taking attendance on the test day and when you're making sure who's shown up and who you need to order makeup materials for. It's the best thing to do to organize yourselves. So what you're going to want to do is pull a list of eligible students from the student information system at your school, or work with your district assessment coordinator to pull a list of students from PSIS and to see all of the juniors that you have to plan for. You'll also want to be aware if you need to add students to that list, if you have new students that are arriving or have arrived since you've pulled the list. You just want to kind of make sure you're keeping that list fresh and always up to date. Test coordinators will also need to work with the SSD coordinators at the school because the test coordinators will need to have access to the NAR, the non-standard administration report, because that will have the accommodations that students will need to be tested with for any students that have testing accommodations. And that's an important document because it lets you know if students need to be in a separate room or which students can be grouped together that have different accommodations. And as you see here on the screen at the bottom, there's a sample of what a master student list can look like. You want to have student information, date of birth, their student ID number. You'll ultimately want to use this as an attendance taking document, so you want a column to mark them either present or absent. And you'll also want to talk about, you also want to have the information about, do they need accommodations? If they do, what grouping are they in so you can plan the right room for them? And then ultimately you'll want to be able to say the type of book that they need if they have accommodations. And you can use this as a way to assign teachers to different groups of students. Okay. As I mentioned, you will need to use the non-standard administration report as a way to be able to also know which students on your master student list need to be tested with accommodations. The non-standard administration report, and you see a sample of it at the bottom of the screen there, it lists all the students that are approved for accommodations in your school, all that you have approved for the test that you're going to be giving. And it'll be grouped into two sections: students that need to test on the primary day, and then students that can test in the accommodated window, that 10-week period of time that you can test students that use the Blue Book. So as you'll see, there's a column on the NAR that says test book color. That gives you the sense of the color of book you're looking for. Some students will need the purple book. Those students test on the primary day. Other students will need the Blue Book. The Blue Book students can test in that 2-week accommodated window. You'll also see there's a column that says 1 or 2 day testing, so you can use that to help figure out when those students will need to test. The NAR is available 4 weeks prior to the test, so you'll want to work with your SSD coordinator to pull the NAR 4 weeks prior to your test, but you're going to want to keep pulling it over time in case there are students that still have pending accommodations as you pull it at 4 weeks. So you'll just want to kind of refresh it every week or two to just make sure it's as accurate, and do it right before test day as well to see if there were any late approved accommodations that came through. The other thing to know about the NAR is that students who are approved for the EL time and 1/2 support will be grouped with other with other time and 1/2 test takers, so they can test in the same room together. They'll be grouped in that area together, so you will know how many students need time and 1/2 together. To manage students on your NAR, the SSD coordinator will run the NAR from the SSD Online dashboard. And when you go in, when the SSD coordinator goes in there, they're going to click Create Non-Standard Administration Report. They'll select the SAT school day, and they enter their AI code and their primary test date. So about that. Then they'll get a message that'll pop up after they've clicked through to create the NAR, and they'll either find out that there are no students approved for accommodations for the SAT school day assessment, that there are students approved for the accommodations and it matches up with the pre-ID file the CSDE provided to us, or that there are students with approved accommodations that match the student registration file, as well as students that are approved but maybe weren't on the pre-ID file. And this can happen if you have new students that come in. So SSD coordinators, if you have that situation where you have students that are approved for accommodations that weren't in the pre-ID file and do need to test, you can pull them, SSD coordinators can pull them onto the NAR. You can manually add them in at this point. So a few best practices to think through when using your rosters. You want to create your roster in either Excel or Word format, whatever you are more comfortable with, but you want to do it in a way so that you can easily sort the data, because sometimes you're going to want to have a full list of all the students and have it in alphabetical order. And other times, if you're creating rosters, room rosters for your staff, so you're gonna, if you've assigned your students to different rooms and you want to tell the proctors in those rooms who to expect in those rooms, you'll want to be able to sort by the proctor or the room number. So you want to be able to have it in Excel or Word format so you can easily manipulate that data and use it as easily and as flexibly as possible for you. You should also create testing room rosters after you assign your students to test rooms. The room rosters should be given to the rosters to the proctors on test day. So you'll have the master student list, but you don't want to give your each proctor the master student list. You want to just have those room rosters about the students that are in a specific room. That'll make it easier for that proctor to know who's coming to them and also plan for those students. And your roster is an incredibly important record-keeping document. So you want to make sure that you're keeping a copy of your roster, your annotated roster, so where you've marked anything that needs to, that any notes you've made, especially whether a student was absent or present for the test day. And you're going to want to make a copy of that and keep it on file at the school for at least 6 months following the test. You're going to return your original roster with your answer sheets to College Board, but keep a copy. And that's in case there's a question, an issue, something comes up, you'll have your documentation there to look at, and it'll make it easier to resolve any problems. You can use PSIS to create your roster. The district PSIS coordinator can follow the steps here to print a roster from PSIS. The coordinator can log into PSIS registration module, click the downloads link, and select active registration and click download. And then they'll end up getting a file they can give you that will show all of the students actively registered in the district, and that can be sorted by grade. All right, so we're gonna talk now about how to plan your space. So plan the space within your school for test day. First, let's start talking about the testing room requirements. It's important because we want to make sure that all students can have an appropriate testing environment and that there's a secure testing environment. Testing rooms have to fulfill a number of different requirements. The first one is the rooms should be located away from noisy areas and distracting activities. That is to make sure that students can have a quiet testing, the opportunity to test in a quiet location, that they're not distracted, and that there isn't any sort of cause for misadministration. You'll also want to try to make sure that the rooms are near restrooms. This is to make it easier for students to get to and from them during breaks, and so things can be most efficient for your test administration. Rooms have to have a working clock that's visible to students, proper lighting, proper ventilation, proper seating that follows the seating requirements, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few slides, and no materials that are related to test content or instructional content on the walls. So, if there's maps or anything like that, up on the walls, you can either remove them, take them down from those walls, or you can just cover them up, take big pieces of paper, chart paper, or whatever, and cover them up. So you just need to make sure that there's no instructional content visible in the room. Okay, let's talk about seating requirements a little bit. For seating requirements, all chairs must have backs. Seats have to face in the same direction. The chairs need to be placed directly behind those in the row in front of them, and that's a test security issue. Each student must be separated by a minimum of 3 feet from side to side. So that's measured from the center of the desk to the center of the next desk. Now, it's especially important for me to point out right now with what we're dealing with COVID, that is a minimum, and that is the College Board minimum separation requirement. That said, you need to follow the spacing guidance provided by your school, your district, and your public health department. So if your local health department and your school require that students are separated by 6 feet, then you should be separating your students by 6 feet. Okay, so you'll want to go by those requirements, and it is whatever you are, however your school is operating right now, and the distance that you have to keep your students separated within your school on a regular school day, you need to make sure that for testing they are at least 3 feet apart, because that's our minimum for College Board security. But you need to follow your health guidelines about what's appropriate in your school building right at this moment. You want to also make sure that staff has unimpeded access to students in case there's an issue or a problem, that staff can easily get to each student. Students may be seated at tables, and they have to be at least 3 feet apart at a table. But again, if you're following your minimums from your district and your local health guidelines, that may be larger. So you want to make sure you know what the minimums are in your district. You want to make sure that every student has a large, smooth writing surface, preferably a desk or a table. And if you need to use tablet armchairs, so those are the desks that have a chair, and then they kind of have a tablet that slips down to serve as a desk. Those you can use those. You just have to have a minimum writing surface of 12 by 15 inches for students on them. And then the following seating arrangements are not allowed: round tables, study carrels, lap boards, language laboratory booths, or tables with partitions or dividers. Now, one note I want to make here: if your school is using clear, like plexiglass dividers between kids' desks, some districts are doing that. If you have clear plastic or plexiglass dividers, that's okay. But dividers that have any sort of kind of opaqueness to them or whatnot, that's not okay. But clear plastic or clear plexiglass dividers are okay currently now with COVID. And then the seating assignments in the room should not follow any sort of expected pattern. You shouldn't have students seated in alphabetical order or any predefined order that students are aware of. You want to make sure that when students come in, they don't know who they're going to be sitting next to. So let's talk a little bit about selecting rooms. You want to select rooms that are in like a separate hall or wing of your school, if that's available in your school building. It's just a good idea to keep the kids who are testing separated from kids who are not testing, just because it keeps noise down and keeps disruptions down. But you want to also make sure that those students in those testing rooms have access to a restroom, and that, like I said, that's going to be important because scheduled breaks, when students have the opportunity to go to the restroom, you want it to be as quick and efficient as possible. And if a student needs an unscheduled break, so something where the clock isn't stopping, it's just one student going out to use the restroom during the test, you want to make sure they can get to the restroom as quickly as possible so they're not losing too much testing time. You also want to consider the school schedule of classes and choose larger classrooms if possible, where you can put more students into tests. This kind of minimizes the reassignment of non-testing students. And you want to review the master student list in the NAR to determine the number of testing rooms that you're going to need. So some accommodations in the NAR do require that students are in a separate testing room. Some accommodations, like a human reader, require one-on-one testing. So you want to go through carefully and look at the NAR and the accommodations your students may have as you're making determinations of the number of rooms and the type of rooms you're going to need. If you do choose a large room, something like a cafeteria or an auditorium, just remember that students cannot face each other, that they have to all be facing in the same direction. And just an important point, Michelle mentioned this a little bit earlier, students can be tested outside. So we know we have some schools that are contending with, kind of large populations of students who are on remote instruction and may need to test them outside of the building because of district kind of parameters and requirements. That is allowed. You can absolutely test students outside. Couple things to think about. Generally, all of these requirements we just talked about need to be met, but the other thing to think about is kind of environmental concerns, right? So if you are planning to test students outside and it's raining or it's snowing or it's really, really cold, that would not work well because they could make a complaint and say they didn't have the proper testing environment and then they need to be retested. So you really just want to think carefully about testing outside. If you do choose to test students outside, you'll probably want to use the later test dates, maybe the May 18th date, if that's an option. So think about that because you need to make sure that not only do they have the desks and all that kind of stuff that requirements met, but that you also are testing them in quite literally an environmental kind of weather situation that's appropriate for testing as well. If you have students that have certain accommodations, like the pre-recorded audio MP3 format or ATC format or electric braille writer and braille note taker, you will need to make sure that your school is providing a computer for that student. A student can't use their personal computer or a computer that belongs to their family to take the test. It has to be a school-provided computer to be able to take the test. And on the school-provided computer, you will have to do some setup work in advance to make sure if they're testing with one of these accommodations. So the test coordinator and the SSD coordinator should work together in advance of test day to test any equipment you're using, to make sure you know exactly what needs to be done to administer the test to the student that needs the computer, to do any setup that may be needed. So for example, as Keisha mentioned earlier, the MP3 streaming application requires setup in advance, downloading the app. Depending on the level of controls and permissions that your school network may have, you may not be able to do it. You may need somebody from your district office to support you in that. So you're just going to really need to be thinking about the setup of computer testing in advance for these folks, just for these students with accommodations, to make sure that everything goes smoothly on their test day. As I mentioned, and so I just mentioned that MP3, it requires the download of the MP3 streaming application. We recommend you do it now because this way you can download the application now. It's okay. And you just want to test to make sure that the application, that you can download it, you can get it set up. If computers at your school are set up to require staff or students to sign in, the application has to be installed on that user profile for the computer that the student will be signed into on test day. So that needs to be a thought process in like the computer you're using and making sure that the student is signed in, and that's how you're downloading it into that student's profile. The MP3 streaming application will only be visible as a desktop icon to the user account on which it was originally installed. And so there are lots of instructions, detailed instructions on the MP3 streaming application access page in SSD Online to help you with this. But that's why we recommend you start now to make sure it's all clear. SSD coordinators are encouraged to review the functionality of the streaming application by accessing a sample test form prior to test day. Again, so you can make sure that SSD coordinators and proctors, that they know how it works before the student is there actually taking the test. And if you encounter any issues, you can contact the SSD office for assistance so the College Board can work with you to resolve any issues well in advance of test day so everything goes smoothly for you and your students. Now on test day, internet access is required for the MP3 audio accommodation on test day. So you need to make sure that the student will have internet access on test day to download the test form, and then the internet availability is then disabled by the testing application once testing begins. Once the application is installed on PC or Mac, the streaming app appears as an icon on the desktop. Chromebooks require you to launch the software from the apps link. And then on test day, the SSD coordinator or proctor will launch the MP3 streaming application. This needs to be repeated for each student prior to the launch of testing. So if your school's computers require login credentials, the person who installed the program onto the computer before test day has to also be present on each day of testing to sign in on the computer and start the application for the student. Proctors may choose to download students' test forms. So proctors can choose to download the test forms for the student if you have a small number of MP3 test takers. However, if you have a number of kids, a large number of kids using MP3 accommodation, there is a section in the MP3 script that includes instructions for the student to actually download the test form themselves. And you will need to have the NAR handy on test day because the MP3 streaming application requires each student's SSD number to then be able to access the test form. Now, you can set up computers for assistive technology compatible format tests as well. ATC format is composed of 5 Microsoft Word files that are created to work with students' assistive technology, such as a screen magnification device or a screen reader. The ACT test forms are delivered on flash drives, so a student must have a computer with a USB port if they're using an ATC format. You'll need to disconnect the computer from the internet and any networks, disable all unapproved assistive features like spell checkers and grammar checkers, thesauruses, all that kind of stuff. You'll need to print the student's last name, first name, and middle initial on the back of the ATC packaging. And before test day, you just want to check each flash drive to make sure that the flash drive you received is functional. And after ensuring the device functions properly, you remove and secure and securely store the flash drive like you would a regular test book. You make sure it's stored securely until it's used on test day. And then students will need access to the password on the flash drive packaging. When taking the test, you want to make sure that you have the packaging for the flash drive with you when you are testing students using that. All right, so let's talk about planning for your staff. Okay, so for staffing, the first thing is you want to think about balancing the resources you have in terms of people resources in your building. Each school needs to have a test coordinator and 1 SSD coordinator assigned for testing. And then the additional staffing that you may need will depend on the number of students you're testing in your cohort, the number of testing rooms you need to have to test those students, and the number of students in each room. So you'll need to start with 1 proctor. Every room needs to have 1 proctor. You need to have a hall monitor for every 5 rooms. So if you have 5 rooms, you need 1 hall monitor. If you have 7 rooms, you're going to need to have 2 hall monitors. So you'll need to figure out how many hall monitors you need. And then you may need room monitors. It depends on the number of students you have testing in each room. There's a section of your manual that's called Plan Your Staff, and there's charts in there that show you how many students in a room. If you have X number of students in a room, you need to have certain X number of additional room monitors. So you'd have a proctor and then room monitors. We got this question the other day, though. There is no kind of minimum. So if you have a proctor in a room and you feel it's useful to have a room monitor and you have the staff to do that, you can have an adult in the room, even if you don't meet the kind of minimum number that we say that where you must have or the maximum number of students in a room to have a room monitor. So you can have the number of adults you think you need in that room to support testing. So as I mentioned, there are a number of roles. The test coordinator supervises all phases of the exam. The backup test coordinator assumes the responsibility. So in the event that the test coordinator or you as the test coordinator can't be there on test day, the backup coordinator is the one who kind of takes over on test day, make sure everything gets done. The SSD coordinator, this is specifically for students that are on the NAR. The SSD coordinator requests the accommodations and then works with the test coordinator to oversee the accommodated testing on test day. The proctor administers the exam to students in a specific testing room, and a room monitor assists a proctor in a room. And then the hall monitor monitors students outside of the testing room, so in the hallways, to make sure that the hallways remain secure and quiet. For the proctor responsibilities are kind of broken up into 2 buckets. There's a responsibility of monitoring students, and then there's the responsibility of administering the test. The monitoring students includes admitting and seating students, enforcing policies, completing the seating chart, and reporting any test irregularities. And then in terms of administering the test, those responsibilities include distributing the test, reading the script word for word, accounting for the test materials, and timing the test. For a room monitor, there's a set of responsibilities. The room monitor can help set up the school and the rooms for testing and can help with admission of students to testing. The room monitor can also answer questions, distribute test materials, or help distribute test materials in a room, monitor test takers and report any test violations. Hall monitors can also help with setting up the school for setup and admission of students. The hall monitors can direct students to the testing room they're supposed to be in. They're supposed to patrol the hallways and report any violations if there are any students kind of doing anything they shouldn't be doing in hallways. And hall monitors can also be used to cover for staff breaks. So if you have a proctor, several proctors, and you need to relieve those proctors to get a bathroom break, your hall monitors can be pulled in to relieve those proctors. You never leave the room unattended without an adult in it, so you can bring in a hall monitor so that proctor can go and use the restroom or have their break. So there is a staffing guidelines form that you need to make sure that you read, that all of your staff read, and that they agree to the terms on the staffing agreement. This includes some general responsibilities for each position. You're going to make sure that everybody's aware of their responsibilities and that you review the testing staff agreement with them, and then that all staff who are serving as test day staff sign the testing staff agreement form. So in terms of thinking about the staffing for your test day, I'm going to share a few things. People who fit any of these categories here cannot administer the Connecticut SAT school day. People who are employed by an outside test prep company or who do outside test prep. Those who have taken, and when I say outside test prep, something outside of something that your school sponsors. If your school sponsors an after school SAT prep course, or there's during class SAT prep that happens, that's fine. But if the person is employed by an outside test prep company, or if they do SAT tutoring on their own and they're paid for it outside of the school, they can't be test day staff. Also, anybody who's taken the SAT within 180 days of the administration date cannot be test day staff. And anyone who has a household member or child taking the SAT at any site on the same day you're giving the test cannot handle test materials or have access to test materials prior to the test, but they can serve as a proctor or hall monitor on test day. Now, one other thing, if, for example, you have a staff member who has a child taking the test at your school, they can serve as a proctor on test day. They can't have access to any of the materials before test day, but they can serve as a proctor on test day, but they cannot proctor their own child or the child that lives with them. You're going to want to consider support staff. So students approved for testing with certain accommodations might require some additional support staff to be able to actually receive those accommodations. This would include possibly a reader to dictate test questions if the student's accommodation is a reader, a sign language interpreter for the directions only, or a scribe to record responses. Support staff has to meet all of the testing staff requirements that I kind of just went through. Never suggest a person to assist a student who is a relative of that student. Students assisted, and just to call out here, especially if you have a student who either has reader or scribe as their accommodation, those accommodations are tested in a one-to-one setting, and so you need to have a reader or scribe for that one student. Those students will test with time and 1/2 unless approved for more time. They must have their own reader or scribe, as I mentioned. You can't share a reader or a scribe amongst multiple students. Scribes may only write what the student dictates in English. They can't prompt the student in any way for any information that would result in a different response. And sign language interpreters may only translate test directions from spoken English, not test content. So once you have your staff identified, you're gonna use the manual to train your staff. You can there's a section in the test coordinator manual called Train Your Staff, and it covers things like maintaining security in the testing room, the seating policies, the calculator policies, general responsibilities of each position, using the correct testing materials, equipping the testing room forms and reports. It includes testing room manual timing charts and checklists so that you're aware of the timing needed. And the testing room manual includes the testing scripts for each of the rooms. So you'll need to also now think about, once you have your staff and your rooms and all that kind of stuff, think about building your schedule for test day. So some things to consider as you're setting your schedule. You need to arrange time for standard testing. So these are students testing with the standard timing. You'll need to be aware and think about arranging time for students that have time and 1/2 testing, as well as students that have double time testing. And you'll need to plan an additional hour for administrative tasks after testing. So after the books have been collected and the answer sheets have been collected in each room, you'll also need to be prepared with additional time for packing up those materials and all that kind of stuff. Something important to remember, bus schedules may need to be adjusted, and lunch periods has to be adjusted so that they take place after testing is completed. So if you look on the screen, the standard testing room timing, so these are for students without any sort of extra time or breaks. The reading section is 65 minutes, and there's a 10-minute break. The writing and language section is 35 minutes, followed by the math no calculator section for 25 minutes. Then there's a 5-minute break. Then there's math with calculator section that's 55 minutes long. Then after that, at that point, the test is completed. So we estimate it takes about 15 minutes to collect the books and the answer sheets from students. So you're looking about you're looking at about 3 hours and 30 minutes of test time there. Now here on the screen, I'm not going to go through each thing individually, but this is actually in the SAT accommodated manual. There are different scripts and section timing for students that may have different timing associated with their test because of accommodations. So time and a half, extra breaks, double time, things like that. So this chart is in the SSD accommodated testing manual, so that you can go through and see that information there. Now, a couple of things to consider for students with extended time, and especially if you're planning extended time students and their testing day and when they'll eat. Time and 1/2, so that's time and 1/2 for the entire test for the students that have that for reading, so therefore they get it for the entire test. That testing takes place in one day, but students will complete the testing just before 1:30 p.m. So they can't eat lunch until after that point, but they will receive 4 5-minute breaks during their testing. And during that time, we encourage students to have snacks available so they can have snacks during those breaks. Double time for students that have double time for reading, so that means they get double time for the entire test. That test takes place over 2 days. The first day of testing ends around noon, and so it can allow for typically a standard lunch break, or it may need some adjustment based on your school schedule. But and then the second day of testing similarly is kind of done around standard lunchtime. Time and 1/2 for math for the math test. This students test in 1 day with that accommodation. Students complete their test just after 12:30 p.m. if they have time and 1/2 just for math. During the testing time, students will receive additional 5-minute breaks. So again, if a student can have a snack during their break time if they would like. And then double time for students who have that for math only. Those students are tested in 1 day. The students will complete testing just before 1:30 p.m. So again, they can't eat lunch till after that point. They will receive 4 5-minute breaks, and so we encourage students to have snacks available during those breaks. So let's talk about setting schedules if you have a late arrival room. If you're you want to set a protocol for late testing if that's allowed. So if you're allowing students to arrive late and still test at your school, there's a section of your manual that says admit students refer to the admit students to the testing area section of your manual, because there's a section in there about late room. You don't have to have a late arrivals room, but if you choose to have one, late testing should start. You need to make sure that late testing is starting no more than 45 minutes after testing has begun in the other testing rooms. The proctor has to close the late arrivals room door before the other testing rooms begin their first break. And you need to ensure that testing in any late arrival room begins early enough to end before your normal school dismissal time. Now, we do offer some additional flexibility for test timing for this spring because of all the things that schools are kind of juggling because of COVID. And this is similar to the flexibility that was offered in the fall. So to allow for additional social distancing options, we are allowing some flexible start times. Schools can choose to start testing earlier or later than usual in the day, but you also have the option to kind of split students into different testing groups in a day and stagger those start times if that helps you. So all timing and break rules will still apply. So no matter when the student starts, they still need to get the full amount of time for testing, and they still need to get the full amount of break time that they're supposed to get. And if you're staggering start times, you need to make sure that all testing is completed within the same day, unless students are approved for multi-day testing accommodations. Cell phone collection is required for the duration of the school day for all students testing. If your school policy doesn't allow for cell phone collection, for the whole day, you need to make sure that you've gotten cell phones collected or at least secured until after the last group has started testing. You want to make sure that students don't have an opportunity to communicate with each other. So students who tested earlier in the day don't have the chance to communicate with students who are testing later in the day and potentially risk exposing test content. And then all cohorts have to have started their testing session before the first cohort completes testing. So let's see here. A few things to consider as you're thinking about your flexible start time. You want to consider arrival and bus schedules and just kind of how students are arriving at your school to think about when you can start testing different groups of students. You want to work with school administrators to keep track of when students will arrive at the school for testing, which will affect your room assignments. You'll need to think about that when assigning testing rooms, and quite literally where you're putting those testing rooms. You'll want to think about, okay, maybe you put, putting students by different entrances and telling students to come into different entrances of the building if they're coming in at different times, things to think about. You want to also assign rooms for separate testing groups in different areas of the school building if you can, because you want to limit the contact between students and disruptions to testing. You want to think carefully about attendance taking if you have kids coming into the building at different times. You want to plan for any necessary changes to attendance taking if you have early groups and late groups. And then you want to think about your students with accommodations, especially those that may have extended time. They will likely have to start in those early groups that you're testing because the length of their test day goes a little bit longer. And then you want to consider students with those accommodations when you're assigning them to those different groups. Like I said, their test day, a student with time and a half spends more time in a day testing, so they'll need to start in that first group of students testing to be able to get done testing in time before the end of the day. So right on the screen, you'll see a sample of a flexible start time schedule. This sample shows 2 different groups testing. That is not, you can have more groups if you'd like. This is just a sample. But they have, in this example, there's a group that will actually start testing. Students report to their testing areas at 7:30 in the first group, and then they report at 9:30 in the second group. The first group starts, the testing room doors close at 8, and in the second group, the testing room doors close at 10. So you can kind of see how it shifts the schedule for group B by them starting 2 hours later. As I mentioned, you can have more than 2 groups. You can have 3 groups, 4 groups, whatever kind of works for you. But you need to make sure that, as I mentioned, that whatever the last group is that you have starting testing, they're starting testing before the first group has completed testing. Some other arrangements you need to make, you want to set aside secure storage for testing materials. Make sure that there is a locked location in your building that you can keep your testing materials. You want to designate an area for test takers to assemble before and after testing, and especially with COVID and social distancing, you'll need to have some sort of rules likely for them to follow in those areas. You want to ensure minimal distractions on test day, so you want to make sure that there are no bells or fire drills scheduled to occur on test day, and that there are no announcements over the loudspeaker. So let's talk now about preparing your students for testing. You'll receive the SAT School Day Student Guide. You'll receive copies of that for your students in your pre-administration shipment, and you want to distribute that to students as soon as possible after receiving them. You want to share information with students about Khan Academy for the free personalized online SAT practice, and you can access that at satpractice.org. You want to meet with students in advance of test day to go over important information, such as where and when they're supposed to report for testing, what they should bring with them, and what not to bring on test day. You should encourage students to talk with their parents and to think about college and scholarship programs that they might want to send their SAT scores to, because they'll get 4 free score sends with their SAT tests. And then you'll want to share the CSDE parent letter and FAQ with parents. That's available on the CSDE website. And let's talk about preparing your materials for test day. So your school will actually receive a number of shipments from the College Board. It's important to note that each shipment may come in multiple boxes. So materials, and that materials, especially when we get into the testing room materials, the test day materials, those books for students with accommodations will arrive separately from the standard test materials. So you'll see there are 4 shipments. The first is the coordinator planning kit. As I mentioned, that's the shipment that is supposed to arrive to you this week. And it's a sample set of manuals and test day forms and posters. There's the pre-administration materials. That includes answer sheets, instruction booklets for students, student guides, and all manuals. If you're testing on March 24th, those will arrive the week of March 1st. And if you're testing on April 13th, those will arrive the week of March 22nd. And at the same time, you're going to receive a separate package that includes the pre-administration pre-ID labels for your school. And then you will get, the last shipment will be your test materials. You'll receive test books, forms, and envelopes and return kits. And if you're testing on March 24th, those materials will arrive at your school the week of March 8th. And if you're testing on April 13th, those will arrive at your school the week of April 5th. For pre-administration materials, schools will receive answer sheets 3 weeks prior to testing. This allows schools to schedule a time to do a pre-administration session and have students grid required demographics. The shipment will include answer sheets, labels, and manuals. The pre-ID label will be generated for all grade 11 students who are in PSIS as of the initial pre-ID file submission date. These labels must be affixed to the answer booklet by school staff prior to testing. You see a sample of that label on the bottom of the screen. When you receive your test materials, you must ensure that they are kept secured and locked with limited access. So before storing, you want to check that you have enough purple books. Those are books for standard testing students and accommodated testing students that are supposed to test on the primary test date. And you've also received enough blue books, and those are for the students that are testing with accommodations during the accommodated testing window. All materials will arrive to the attention of the test coordinator. Materials for students with accommodations will arrive separately from standard materials, but still come to the test coordinator. It's important to keep your test materials secure, so you want to alert your school office staff that the shipment is arriving in the week prior to testing. You want to have a locked storage area ready with limited access and a secure lock on the door or wherever you're keeping those tests. Do not remove any testing materials from the school without the consent of CSDE and the Office of Testing Integrity with College Board. Now, the only exception for this is if you do need to, for example, utilize your district office or another location like that to test some of your students that may be remote students. We know that some schools can't bring their students into their school building, and so they may test them at another location. That's okay. You can remove those on the morning of the test. The person who's serving as the person that's in charge of testing at that location can come pick those materials up from your school, takes them to that location, like I said, the district office or whatever location you may be using. They have to keep those materials secure for usage with students at that offset location, and then bring them back to you to be able to be included in the material shipment back to College Board. If you are if you're a test, this is especially important here, if you're a test center offering SAT weekend testing on March 13th, some schools do offer weekend testing in Connecticut on March 13th. If you also are set to administer the school day test on March 24th, you want to make sure, because you will have materials for both tests in your building at the same time. So you want to make sure that those materials are kept separate from each other. You'll want to mark in giant letters, what's for weekend testing, what's for SAT school day. You keep them in separate sections of a room or a closet, whatever you do. Make sure you're using the correct materials for the correct day, because you don't want to have a situation where kids have to retest because of a misadministration. And then just make sure to check out the section of your manual, prepare your materials. It'll just cover all the specifics you need to think about for keeping your materials secure. You'll want to utilize the shipping notice. You see here is a sample shipping notice. Couple things to point out on the shipping notice. There's a serial number range on the shipping notice. In that oval there, you can see it. We let you know the range of serial numbers on those test books that have arrived to you. You want to look and make sure that the books that you have received match the serial number range that is on your shipping notice. You also want to check the test date that's on your shipping notice to make sure that you have the correct materials for testing. Like I said, especially if you're a weekend SAT test center, you want to look at your shipping notice and see what test date are these materials for. Okay, let's you want to check your test materials when you get them. You want to make sure you have enough and you have the right stuff. You need to keep those materials shrink wrapped until test day, though. The test books come in shrink wrap. Keep that shrink wrap intact until the morning of the test. Check your roster to make sure, as your source, to make sure you have the right number of test books and you have enough test books for students listed on the standard roster and the NARM. Now, after you check those materials, you want to reseal the carton with the tape provided in the carton. You sign your name across the tape so it's clear that it's secured, and lock them in a secure storage area. Check the materials daily to make sure that they haven't been tampered with, that the tape hasn't been opened, anything like that. If you do see any signs of tampering, you have to contact us immediately. So when do you call us, though? Call College Board if you have not received materials by the Friday before your test date. Now you should get them before that. But if you are still waiting for materials, or let's say you realize you didn't have enough materials and you called us and needed more, and you still don't have them the Friday before the test day, call us. Call us if you're missing standard materials. You can call the College Board SAT School Day Support and choose option 2 for test materials questions. Now, if you're missing non-standard materials, so materials for students testing with accommodations, you can call the College Board School Day Support line, and then you choose option 3 for SSD. And if you see that the materials have been tampered with or damaged in any way, or if you have materials missing from your shipment, call College Board School Day Support and you choose option 2 for test materials questions. For the coordinator, the test materials kit that you receive, you're going to check your packing list for materials. You're going to receive forms in your test materials kit. There's a test materials kit within these boxes. You'll receive forms, posters, tape, and shipping labels and material return envelopes. You want to make sure you've gotten all of that stuff. Let's talk a little bit about pre-administration session in here too, because you do receive materials for a pre-administration session. What is that? The pre-administration session allows students to complete activities directly on their answer sheet in advance of test day, saving a little time on test day. So they can fill out the select personal information fields that need to be filled out. And this is also important for students to, if they want to select colleges or scholarships to receive their scores, they have to put that information on their answer sheet. You see there's a inset of field 15, which is where students will put their score reporting codes for any schools they want to send, or any college or scholarship programs they want to receive their scores. So this is done during a pre-administration session. Also, we just want to call out one of the things that students will need to fill out is their date of birth. There's a little bit of a discrepancy in the manual. It says date of birth field is both field 7 and field 8. So date of birth is actually just field 7. So you'll see on the answer sheet there. When you are doing a pre-administration session and you're putting pre-ID labels on those answer sheets, you want to verify the information on those pre-ID labels. If a student's first or last name listed on the label doesn't actually correctly reflect the student's name, please do not use that label. That label. Okay, if the student's name is not correct, do not use the label. If any other information is incorrect, like the date of birth or the student ID number or school information, you can still use the label. Information included on the pre-ID label is based off of data in PSIS. So if you see errors for any student data on those labels, please contact your district PSIS coordinator so that PSIS can be updated with the right information for a student. And if you receive incorrect labels or labels for students that are no longer enrolled at your school or for students that are participating in the alternate assessment, you can shred or destroy those labels in a secure manner. Okay, so you can schedule a session, a pre-administration session in advance of test day to allow your students to fill in student background information on their answer sheet and request their 4 free score cents. Now you can also do this on test day, and we know that some schools, especially in the current environment with COVID, may need to do it on test day. You can do this on test day, you just need to plan for the time to do it, so you'll need to extend your test, the length of your testing time on test day if you're doing a pre-administration session as part of your test day activities. You'll want to affix the pre-ID label to the front of the students' answer sheets before the session, before you give the answer sheets out to students. And you'll need the following information the following items to conduct your session: the answer sheets and pre-ID labels, the blank answer sheets, student answer sheet instructions, the SAT school day student guides, and the testing manual containing the pre-administration instructions and scripts. So all students need to bubble a set of required fields as kind of an additional verification process. But so all students do have to do some bubbling on the front of the answer sheet. Students with a pre-ID label only need to bubble the name, student ID number, state student ID number, date of birth, and test type. Students who do not have a pre-ID label will need to bubble their name, their testing location, their school code, state student ID number, grade level, date of birth, gender, and test type. And if you're conducting the session, you'll need to use the script in the SAT School Day standard or the accommodated testing manual, depending which testing room you're in, under the session conducting the pre-administration session. Some students who take the test may be absent for the pre-administration session. So both of those testing manuals include instructions for assisting students to complete the student information and score sends on test day. And again, so you'll need to be prepared for some students that may have been absent for the pre-administration session, but there is information in the scripts. So if you were not able to do a pre-administration session with all your students, you can do that on test day. And then students can add or change their 4 free score sends on test day. So if a student comes in a pre-administration session, puts down 4 schools they want to send stuff to, goes home and changes their mind, on test day, they can change that information. That is okay. All right, we are getting there. We're at the during the test section. These last 2 sections are much faster. So let's talk about what you do and what you need to prepare for during the test. So this is kind of a suggested test day schedule. You can adjust the timing based on your needs, but you're going to want to think through when do you have staff arrive and make sure that the facility is prepared for testing. And then at what point will you meet up with your staff, review assignments for staff assignments and room assignments? When do you distribute your materials to the staff? And when do you make sure that staff sign the necessary forms? And then you also want to consider at what point staff then report out to their testing rooms, and at what point do you prepare for student arrival. Some best practices for distributing test materials. The day before test day, we suggest that coordinators put together testing room packets for each of the test rooms to include test materials and fill out the name of each proctor and serial number on the testing room materials report form. You want to maybe use clear plastic tubs or some other kind of container so you can put in there all of the forms that they need, all the things they need for testing, as well as to be able to put test materials in them on the morning of the test, and then you want to keep them sealed in plastic wrapping until until the actual test. But you want to maybe have these things in bins or some other kind of container. So then when it is time to actually have staff take materials, it's easy to just give them the bin that goes with their room. For distributing non-standard test materials, you want to use the NAR to determine the correct color test book. So as I mentioned, there's either blue books or purple books for students in the NAR. So you need to look at the NAR to determine which books they're supposed to get, and if there are any other materials that they're supposed to have, and to distribute to each student testing with accommodations. Testing students using incorrect materials may result in student scores being invalidated. Additional test materials, so for example, a reader script may be provided for support staff, so you also want to be aware of what else you may need to include for certain students. The test coordinator will distribute these materials to the staff when they distribute other test materials during the test administration, and collect them for return after all testing is complete. And you can refer to the NAR for specific materials to give each student according to their approved accommodations or supports. So for admitting and seating students, schools can plan to either have a centralized check-in or a room check-in. So you can have a centralized check-in. Every student comes to a central location, checks in, there's somebody with the master student list and checking kids off, and then sending them off to their assigned testing rooms. Now, if that doesn't work for you, you can actually let students know in advance which testing room they're supposed to go to, and you can have the proctor handle the check-in at each of those testing rooms, checking in only those kids that are supposed to be in those rooms. And then what would happen is the test coordinator would need to collect those kind of room rosters from each of the proctors and use those to complete the master student list and keep track of who was present and absent for testing. When admitting students to the rooms, do not allow students to select their own seats. The proctor can either randomly assign seats to students in the room or pre-assign seats, and making sure it's in some sort of random pattern that the students wouldn't know they would be sitting next to each other. When you're checking students in, to mark the roster, write P next to each student who is present, and then later, when you're consolidating rosters or looking through the list, just write an A next to each student who's absent. You can add any missing student information, their student's name, date of birth, their state student ID number at the bottom of the roster if you're missing anything and you need that. Now, admitting new or transfer students. Students who begin attending your school after the first registration file was submitted may still be permitted to test if they meet the following requirements. You want to, or if your school meets the following requirements. Check your materials to see if you have enough materials to accept new or transferred students into your school to also test on school day. You can't borrow materials from another school. If you have enough materials and the space to test students, you need to have the student complete all fields on their answer sheet, including the state assigned student ID number, and then enter that student, ensure that student is accurately reflected in PSIS as well. If you don't have enough materials or and you can't test those students on the primary date, you can plan to test those students on the makeup date of either the April 27th, 28th, or May 18th. So for students that may want to change to non-standard testing or standard testing, apologies for the dog barking in the background. Students who have last-minute approval for accommodations. You may have some students who receive last-minute approval for an accommodation. Those students may need to change from a standard testing room to a non-standard testing room. So you need to be prepared to do that if necessary. If you have enough books and the student doesn't need a non-standard format of the exam, you can move the student to the non-standard testing room. A student who opts not to use his or her approved accommodation, and a student can choose to decline their accommodation for the test, but they need to provide a written note that's signed by the student's parent or guardian if the student is under 18. If the student's 18, they can provide a written note themselves. But the note has to be kept on file at the school. You don't send that back to College Board, but that's really for you to have documentation that the student has chosen and the parent has agreed, or the parent or guardian has agreed to allow the student to decline the accommodation. You don't need to fill out an IR form, anything like that. The student can opt to decline their accommodation, and if you have enough materials, you can test them that way. Mark the student absent on the standard roster and add him or her to the non-standard administration roster, or wherever, so you'll just move the student around to the appropriate roster if you have students changing to or from non-standard testing. On testing, you'll need to think about how you manage your breaks. So break time is not part of testing time. The clock stops during the different breaks between the sections. Cell phones and other electronic devices are prohibited during those break times, during testing in general, but specifically also during the break times. So if you have students approved to use a cell phone or medical device as an accommodation, you'll need to follow the instructions in the accommodated testing manual for securing that device during testing and during break times. Proctors must secure the materials during breaks, and students should not converse during breaks. And for students testing with accommodations, some students may be approved for extra or extended breaks. These students are still subject to the same regulations that apply to students with standard breaks in terms of, not communicating with other students, not using cell phones, all those kinds of things. So they just may have more breaks. Break time is not included as part of testing time, so the clock stops during that. Specific timing instructions are noted in the scripts for students that may have extra or extended breaks. Some best practices for managing breaks. Tell students exactly what time they must be back in their seats. If possible, designate nearby restrooms for the use of testing students only. And do not allow non-testing students in the hallway near the students near the testing rooms. You'll want to monitor halls, so you don't want to allow students to converse in the halls, and they cannot use electronic devices in the halls during testing. You also want to monitor the restroom to make sure that students aren't discussing test content or anything in the restroom, and you want to monitor restrooms during scheduled breaks. You also want to make sure that you are preventing theft of any test materials. In the testing room, you want to keep materials out of the reach of students until they're actually testing, and then you want to secure the materials on breaks. Never ask students to distribute test materials. Make sure no one copies, removes, or photographs any part of the test materials, and never ever leave test materials unattended. Now, one of the ways that you make sure your materials are always counted for is that you kind of count them at multiple points. The proctor needs to keep the materials out of the reach of the students unless they're actually testing at that moment. They need to count test books before distributing, after distributing the materials, and before dismissing the students. And then they should distribute test books in serial number order. You want to account for all materials on the testing materials report form. So overall, you're going to be counting test materials at 6 times at 6 times. When materials are delivered to the school, when they're distributed to proctors, then the proctor is going to count them when he or she has received them. Then in the testing room, the proctor is going to count them again after distributing them to the students, so make a count of what they've got that's in the students' hands, and then counting again once they've been collected before dismissing the students. And then the test coordinator counts them again when they get the materials back to the proctors. The proctor's use of forms. You want to train your staff on how to use the different forms. The room roster, the testing material report form with the seating chart, the irregularity report form, and the request to cancel scores form. So the room roster, the most important section of the room roster for a proctor is kind of in that red square on the screen, and that's tracking the attendance of students in that room, so whether they're present or absent. The proctor is going to make notations on the testing room materials report. So the testing room materials report has a seating chart on it. The seating chart is found on the back of the testing room materials report, and the proctor needs to kind of use that chart to show where students are seated and to write in the serial number on that seating chart of the different books that are in the different locations. Okay, it's an important part of what the proctor needs to do. The irregularity report, that's the report you see on the screen. You use this to record, as I mentioned earlier, any unexpected issue or testing room happening in the testing room or at the school. So any interruptions, shortage of materials, student illness, misconduct, if there's a defective test book for some reason, any prohibited items that are found. Some issues may need to be immediately called out to CSDE or SAT school data support. So there's an appendix in the back of the coordinator manual that kind of lists out all of the different, a lot of the different categories of irregularities. And in some cases, we'll simply tell you, okay, if this thing happens, you just report it on a regularity report and you send it in to us. But in some cases, we will tell you to contact us so that we can give you instructions on how to proceed. You'll also want to make sure that each proctor knows about how to use the SAT request to cancel test scores form. So each proctor should have copies of this form in their room. And if a student becomes ill, the proctor signs the form and records it on the IR. Students can choose to cancel their scores if they want to. They have up to the 3rd day after test day to cancel their scores. So at that point, their scores will not appear in their College Board account, but their scores will still be provided to CSDE for state accountability purposes. Staff should also staff should have their test books, we talked about in serial number order, and pre-labeled answer sheets. They should have a copy of the roster and or the NAR with pre-assigned testing room assignments. And then they should have the correct testing manual for the room that they're in. They should also post the testing in progress flyers in prominent areas in the hallways and outside their rooms and stuff, so that it's clear to any other student or adult passing by that testing is in progress and they should remain quiet. To prepare their test room, each proctor should post information on the board, the date, the AI code of the school, the high school name and city, room number, start time, end time for the section, a reminder to use number 2 pencils, and a reminder not to use a pen or mechanical pencil. If you have students testing with accommodations using ATC or MP3 test formats, you may also need to include some additional information on the board to support kind of computer navigation for them. There's information in the accommodated testing manual about what else to put on the board in those cases. Proctors must read the script verbatim to students, use the NAR to determine which script or accommodation or script you'll need for students testing with accommodations. We're going to watch for common student infractions like the use of a cell phone, attempts to copy, attempts to remove test materials. Never leave the room and test materials unattended, and secure test materials out of the reach of students when they are not testing. Before dismissing students, proctors need to collect answer sheets and distribute books in the same order in which they were collect the books in the same order in which they were distributed. They need to verify each student's identifying information, so they need to check the pre-ID label that was applied to the answer sheet and page 1 of the answer sheet. Make sure that it's done for completeness, but also that that information that is both written on that is typed on the pre-ID label and written and bubbled in match each other. Proctors also need to account for all materials by count and also verify by serial number that they have everything, and that they should not dismiss students until all test materials have been accounted for. For the testing room materials report, they'll need to fill in the date, the center number, room number, type, and proctor's name. They indicate the test books and the serial number range that they have, and they use the back of the form for the testing. You use the form in the back of the cover of the testing manuals, and on the back of that form is where the seating chart is. Some best practices in the testing room. You want to mark the serial numbers on the testing room materials report during the first test section. So get that done during the first test section. You're going to have extra number 2 pencils in every testing room. Ensure that there's a working clock and it is visible to students in each testing room. You want, if this is consistent with your school rules, make a plan for collecting students' cell phones before testing starts and returning them at the end of testing. And then on test day, remember to have students fill out the form code ID, test ID, and test book serial numbers in the complete on test day section on the back of the answer sheet. And there is information in the script that will instruct you to do that. For those who are proctoring in an accommodated testing room, coordinators will need to complete the first page of the NAR and sign the form after testing. Return the completed NAR in the white envelope, the white accommodated testing envelope, with used answer sheets in the answer sheet return shipment. It's important to sign off on the NAR. All right, let's talk about monitoring testing. Proctors need to be aware to check for prohibited devices and aids. Students cannot have any of the information below on this slide in the testing area or break area, except if a student is approved to have it for as part of their accommodation. So they can't have electronic equipment of any kind. That includes phones, personal computing devices like laptops, notebooks, Bluetooth devices, wireless earbuds, any of that. They can't have cameras, separate timers of any kind. They can't have audio players or recorders or headphones. They can't have any sort of wearable technology. They can't have digital watches, including smartwatches. They can't have any other prohibited device that can be used to record, transmit, or receive information. They also can't have highlighters, rulers, earplugs, books or references of any kind, pens or mechanical or colored pencils, and papers of any kind, including scratch paper. Now, of course, a student could be approved for an accommodation that may allow them scratch paper, so that's a different story. But typically, but most students cannot have any of the things listed there on that list. Calculators are not allowed on the desk except for the mathematics with calculator section. Snacks and drinks must be packed out of sight in the testing room and can be consumed only during breaks. Snacks must be outside of the testing room and away from test materials whenever possible. Number 2 pencils are obviously allowed in the testing room, and test books, in the test book, that can actually be used for scratch work. So students don't have separate scratch paper, but they can write in their test book if they need to do scratch work. Calculator policies. The coordinator manual includes a list of calculators with approved calculators that are approved for use during the Math with Calculator section. Test takers can also bring a backup calculator with extra batteries, but test takers cannot share calculators. A no calculator symbol appears at the top of the Math with no calculator section. So that's the section in which calculators are not allowed. Seat any test takers using a calculator with large characters, 1 inch higher or more, or a raised display that could be visible to other test takers in a location where the other test takers can't view that calculator. Some best practices for handling electronic devices. If your school already collects phones and electronic devices for testing, keep doing the method that works for you to do so. If you don't currently collect student electronic devices, we suggest kind of instructing students to disable alarms and powering off cell phones when they enter a testing room. You can collect students' cell phones and wearable technology in a basket or envelope or bag before testing. A lot of times people will use Ziploc bags to collect them and write a student's name on them. You can give students sticky notes or smaller envelopes or bags to label their items. And you can collect label items from students once they're seated. Some additional information about prohibited devices here. At the beginning of testing, the proctor will read in the scripts reminding students to turn off their phones and other electronic devices and to turn them into the proctor, if that's allowed under school policy. If your school does not permit the collection of devices, the proctor has to instruct students to store their powered down devices in a bag or backpack that's placed on the side of the room that's not part of the testing area. Once the script has been read, if a student is observed with a prohibited device, the test coordinator must dismiss that student. A student doesn't need to be holding a phone for it to be considered in their possession. A phone is considered in the student's possession if it's on or under the student's desk or in their pocket. If a student's phone makes noise while in the proctor's possession and stored away from the student's desk, that doesn't need to be considered grounds for dismissal, but the proctor should turn off the phone in order to prevent additional disturbances during testing and issue a warning to the student. So as I mentioned, if you have issues on test day, there's the irregularity chart in the back of the manuals. And so it's by section type of there's different types of irregularities that can occur, provides you with information about what you should do and how to fill out the IR. If you need assistance, please contact SAT School Data Support if you're directed to do so in the IR chart, or if you find that you're not sure what to do, just call us and ask. And that's the better, if you don't know what to do, it's better to call and ask, and we can provide you with directions. So you report testing incidents on the irregularity report form. All reports should be complete, and you want to make sure that they kind of have all sorts of explicit details about what happened. It makes things easier for us to determine what happened with the irregularity the more detail you put in the form, and it also, and the more detail you put in the form, the less likely it is that we're going to have to call you and discuss what happened. The person reporting the incident should include his or her own contact information though, because there may be sometimes where we do need to follow up with you and ask questions. And if you are noting a group irregularity, you want to include the testing room code if there has been one assigned to that room, and you want to include the names of all the students involved in the irregularity on the last page of the irregularity report. So if there's something that affects a whole room of students, for example, you fill out one irregularity report for that group of students, and you just list all those students on that report. Some best practices for monitoring testing. You want to make plans for staff breaks ahead of time. Arrange for how your staff can communicate with you if they need you. You want to collect room rosters at a prearranged time so that you can consolidate them before testing ends. And you want to follow rules from the manual for break time and clearly convey them to students and staff before test day. Okay, we're in the home stretch here. After the test. After the test, you need to complete all the forms, all the reports and forms we talked about, and retain copies of all documentation related to the administration for 6 months after the test. Particularly, you want to make sure you have copies of the IR forms, the attendance rosters, and tracking numbers. So you keeping copies makes it that much easier to address any issues that may come up after testing. If you have copies of everything that you send to us, this way you can look at it and it makes it much, much easier to be able to resolve that issue. So make sure you keep copies of everything. And you want to make sure that you write down the tracking numbers. You receive labels, UPS labels, to return the materials, but write down the tracking numbers so that you can keep track of the shipment progress. So you'll see here, there's a chart here of the different forms, and as we already talked about the different purposes of them. So there are a number of forms that you need to complete. Let's see here. You want to look in the appendix of the coordinator manual that tells you what to do with each of the different forms, which ones you should keep, which ones you should return, anything you should destroy. Now, the coordinator report form, that's the one that the coordinator fills out, as the name suggests. This needs to be returned by the test coordinator for each test date. So, for example, you need to return a coordinator report form for your primary test date. If you then do makeup testing on April 27th, you return a coordinator report form for then. If you're going to do makeup testing also on May 18th, you return a coordinator report form for that date as well. So you need one for each date of testing. When testing is concluded, the test coordinator is required to count the number of answer sheets and record the numbers on the CRF, this coordinator report form. The form is scanned, so you have to use a number 2 pencil to complete it. And you may keep a copy of this form for your records, but you need to send the original one to us. Confirm your school code is right on there. It's going to be pre-filled in item 4 on that form. Just make sure it's right. And it's required for reporting scores to your school and your district in the state. So you want to make sure that's correct on the coordinator report form. If it's not correct, contact SAT School Day Support and we will help you. You want to make sure you bubble the correct date on the CRF. So, for example, if you're testing on April 13th, make sure you bubble in April 13th. If you're doing makeup testing on April 27th, make sure you bubble in April 27th. Returning critical materials. So there are instructions in the coordinator manuals for returning test materials. There are diagrams of how to pack the boxes. So the order in which you should have answer sheets together, envelopes, certain envelopes are supposed to have certain forms in them. All of that is detailed in your coordinator manual. So really look at that and follow those instructions that are there. For SAT, you will receive 2 sets of return materials. You're going to receive a set of return materials for all standard and non-standard testing students who finish on the primary administration, and you're going to use that set of return materials to send those back to us, to send those test books and answer sheets back to us. You're also going to receive another set of return materials for any students that test in the accommodated window. And then once all of the students that were supposed to test in the accommodated window have tested, then you consolidate those students' answer sheets and test books and return those to us. Answer sheets for students testing with accommodations or EL time and 1/2 should be returned in the white accommodated testing envelope. And the new standard test materials will be sent for the makeup test dates. And so you'll get new materials for your makeup dates, okay? But then you will also get return kits to go with those materials for the makeup date. You package your answer sheets and your test books separately. So answer sheet return bags or boxes, depending on the number of students at your school. You may either have what's called a jiffy bag, they're kind of a heavy-duty plastic bag, or you may have a box. They will have two labels pre-applied, a colored label and a UPS shipping label. You want to use the answer sheets and other materials needed for scoring from the primary school day test date have to be returned the day after the test. You want to keep unused answer sheets until after the makeup administration is done. So any answer sheets that have pre-ID labels on it or demographic information on it, if the student was absent, you keep that until after the makeup testing. Make sure to accurately and completely fill out the required fields on the colored label. So you see there's an olive green colored label there. You'll need to fill out a little bit of information. There's a line that'll read kind of like box blank of blank. So like box 1 of, if you're sending back 2 boxes of answer sheets, you're going to say one will be box 1 of 2 and one will be box 2 of 2. Do not include your test book shipment box count with your answer sheet shipment box count. These are 2 separate shipments. The white accommodated envelope. When you're packaging the answer sheets, all answer sheets for any student who is listed on the NAR should be placed in the white accommodated envelope for return. This includes English learners testing with time and 1/2. Make sure to only include answer sheets for students on the NAR in the white accommodated envelope. We assume that all answer sheets returned in this envelope tested with an accommodation or the English learner support that used time and 1/2. If the answer sheet is included for a student that did not test with an accommodation or with EL time and 1/2, that student's score will go on hold for using an unapproved accommodation. So make sure the answer sheets that go in the white accommodated envelope are only for students that tested with an accommodation or the EL support of time and 1/2. So when you package up the test books, again, you're going to use that's separate than your answer sheets. Your answer sheets go to one place, your test books go to a different place. You'll reuse the boxes that you received your test books in to then return the test books to us. There are loose UPS labels that are included in the shipment, and they have the header on the top that says TD returns. So look for those labels when you're receiving your materials and you're going through them. Set them aside to a place where you can keep them safe and you know where they are. Sometimes these labels shift to the bottom of the box during shipment, so you might need to look around the box for them. The test material pickup. This is important. Test coordinators will use their schools regularly scheduled UPS pickup to return materials if you have one. If your school does not have UPS regularly show up at your school, you can contact them either online or by calling them and using the information that's on the prepaid label we've provided to you to then arrange for an answer sheet, arrange for a pickup so that you do not have to pay for. So you want to look at the pickup kind of pickup schedule here. We want to return after the primary test date, return materials no later than the day after the primary test date. The accommodated window, you want to return materials from the accommodated window no later than the day after all accommodated testing is complete, but no later than the end of the window. And then for the makeup date, if you're doing testing on a makeup date, no later than the day after the makeup date. Now the absolute final drop dead dates to return answer sheets to be scored is April 29th for the test dates that are in March and April, and May 20th, that's for the May 18th test materials only. In addition to the coordinator manual, there's information on the new materials return process on the College Board website as well. So how to schedule your self-service UPS pickup. So the makeup survey, you will receive, this is a little bit different this year. Test coordinators will receive 2 makeup surveys this year. The first one's going to be the day prior to your primary test date. Okay. And that will provide you with makeup materials for April 27th and or April 28th. And then you'll also receive one the day before, so the April 27th makeup date. So on April 26th, you'll receive a second makeup survey, and that will be for materials you'll need for May 18th, if you indeed need to test students then. The email will contain a link to a survey to assist in determining the makeup materials you'll need. You need to respond to the survey even if you don't need makeup materials, so we can accurately track responses. This year, the survey will inquire about makeups for absentee students testing with blue accommodated testing materials as well. Okay, so typically you just test those students during the window. If your school, for example, is closed, has closures during the accommodated testing window, and you can't test those students during the accommodated testing window, you can order makeup materials for those students that use Blue Books for either of the makeup dates. Okay, so that's a different thing for this year. Only request those materials if you are unable to test these students in the initial accommodated testing window. And then do not administer a makeup test to a student who took the standard test unless you have contacted College Board to report an irregularity during the primary testing. Just a quick mention of fee waivers. Although CSDE is paying for the students' SAT registration for this particular SAT school day test, students who qualify for fee waivers can receive SAT school day fee waiver benefits. So things like unlimited free score sends, college application fee waivers, and SAT weekend administration fee waivers if they want to take the SAT on a weekend in the future. Schools will receive codes in a file that will be available directly in the College Board K-12 reporting, K-12 score reporting portal. So, so you can give those to students that that qualify for fee waivers, so they can get those additional benefits. So more is going to be shared with you in March about that. Alrighty, I'm not sure if we have any questions that are unanswered.
No, but if people have questions, now would be a great time to pop them into the question box, or you could raise your hand. I know it was a lot of material. All right, we've got a hand, so. All right. Bear with me. We've got a couple hands. Connell, you want to go ahead? You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the presentation. Quick question. If we know that we are not going to administer the test on March 24th because we are asynchronous, is there any chance that we can hold the delivery so that we do not need to send it back as we did in the fall?
Thanks, that's a great question. So two things on that front. So Michelle had sent out the survey where we were asking for people's information about that, about their testing plans. If you can just make sure that we get that in that survey so that we can prepare appropriately for the makeup materials we need to have available, that'd be great. Now, we will try to cancel orders, but we can't guarantee that that's going to happen. Because of the volume of tests that we actually administer on these school days, we actually start pulling these materials really early as the beginning of January and prepping them. So we may not be able to do that. So if you have somebody at the building when it's delivered and you know that the time frame that the test material is being delivered, you can, rather than having to receive them, get the labels out and send them back, you can also refuse the delivery if you want to, and just refuse to accept it, and they will send it back to us that way. You're on mute, Michelle.
If I sent out the email yesterday with the link to two surveys, the administration survey and also the one about when you do the training of your staff. So if you have any problems completing it, or you just want to email me, you can certainly do that as well. And then we have another question, a hand raised. Jessica Lilienthal.
Yes, I was just curious to see if a student who is accommodated with a 4-function calculator, can they be in the general setting, or do they need a small group?
Keisha, are you going to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I was just going to say, they can actually test in the same room as the other students. You don't have to place them in a small group.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
We had another question. Is a reader a person or a recording?
So a reader is a person, right? If the student is approved for, I'm sorry, Keisha, I jumped in here, but if the student is approved for reader, that's a person. If a student is approved for the MP3 accommodation, that's the recording. Keisha, I'm right there, right? I didn't misspeak.
Hit it on the nail. Absolutely right. I was just going to also note that a part of the language that you will also see in SSD Online with the change is that it now says human reader, to be very specific. So that's just an FYI.
Okay, we had another question about the NAR and the ability to download it as a CSV file. I don't know anything about that. Keisha, I don't know if there's a way to do that or how you download it.
To upload to view the NAR, I'm sorry, can we just clarify what the
Yeah,
question is?
it's so the roster, can they actually print out, they can print out the roster, but can they download it to their computer?
You cannot download it so the roster you can print. The NAR you can actually, when you open it, once it becomes available 4 weeks prior to your primary test date, you can actually download that and save it. But you just have to remember, and Adrian will likely mention this as well, is that if you still have other students that are pending for any reason, you want to go back in and refresh that NAR again, because you want to make sure that all of your students are reflecting on the NAR with their approved accommodations.
And Keisha, when you download the NAR and save it to your computer, I think it saves as a PDF, right?
PDF.
Right. I
Yes,
don't think
as a PDF.
as a CSV or Excel file.
No.
I
Only
think
as a
they
PDF.
wanted to be able to put it into a spreadsheet and be able to work with it more. So it doesn't sound like you're able to do that. I guess unless you had like Adobe Writer or something, then you could convert it, right? You could convert it somehow.
Adobe Pro.
Yeah, if you had the right version. But anyway, I don't see any more questions, and I know we're just past time. It was a lot of material, and thank you for the really clear presentation, Adrian. And thank you everyone for attending. Please feel free to follow up with questions via email, and we will definitely get back to you. So thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.